The wind is a thief in this godforsaken place. It steals the warmth from your bones, the hope from your heart, and the last, faint cries from your child's lips. Sarah clutches her son, Leo, to her chest, the boy's small body a fragile furnace against the encroaching cold of the abandoned line shack. 5 days. 5 days since the last of the hardtack turned to dust in their mouths. The hunger is no longer a pang but a hollow, aching void. Leo doesn't cry anymore. He just shivers, his breath shallow and thin as cobwebs. Sarah presses her ear to his chest, praying to a god she's no longer sure is listening, just to hear the faint, fluttery drum of his heart. Outside, the Wyoming prairie stretches into an infinity of brown and gray under a merciless sky. It was supposed to be a new beginning. Now it looks like the end. A shadow falls across the shack's broken doorway. Sarah's head is too heavy to lift, but a primal fear jolts through her. A man on a horse, silhouetted against the unforgiving light. He's large, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of a worn hat. He dismounts, his boots crunching on the dry, dead earth. He's just a shape, a presence of silent power. He takes a step closer, his gaze falling on the pathetic bundle she's become, then on the small, still form in her arms. His face is weathered, carved by sun and solitude, his eyes the color of a winter sky. She expects pity, or disgust, or worse, the predatory gleam of a man who knows she has nothing left to bargain with. She gets none of it. He just looks, his expression unreadable stone. Then his gaze locks on hers, and for the first time in days, someone sees her. Not a problem, not a stray, but a person. He gives a curt, decisive nod, more to himself than to her. Get ready to ride with me. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments. What's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The words are not a question, but a command forged from quiet authority. For a moment, Sarah can only stare. Hope is a dangerous, foreign thing, a muscle she's forgotten how to use. But the man, this stranger, is already turning back to his horse, moving with an economy of motion that speaks of a life lived without waste. He retrieves a canteen and a small, cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. He kneels, his presence filling the cramped, dusty space. He doesn't offer the water to her first. He uncaps it and gently, so gently it makes her throat ache, touches the metal rim to Leo's pale, cracked lips. A single drop clings there, then another. The boy stirs, a faint whimper escaping him. The man's large, calloused thumb brushes the moisture across his mouth. Only then does he hold the canteen out to her. Small sips, he says, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. The water is life. It's cool and clean, and it scours the dust from her throat. She wants to gulp it down, to drown the emptiness, but his steady gaze holds her to his command. He breaks off a piece of jerky from the bundle. For the boy, let him suck on it. Not eat. He places the tough, salted meat in her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, impersonal second. His touch is rough, but not unkind. It's the touch of a man who works with his hands, who understands tools and leather and the heft of the world. He helps her to her feet. Her legs tremble, threatening to buckle. He steadies her with a firm grip on her arm, his strength a solid wall she can lean against. He leads her out into the blinding light, his horse, a sturdy, dark bay, waiting patiently. Can you ride? He asks. She nods. Though the thought of hoisting herself into a saddle feels like an impossible feat, he seems to understand. Without a word, he takes Leo from her arms. The boy is so light. The man holds him with an unexpected ease, cradling him against his chest as if he were a precious, fragile load. With his free hand, he cups his other hand into a stirrup. Up, she pulls herself into the saddle, her worn skirt catching on the horn. She sways, dizzy from the sudden height and the gnawing hunger. He passes Leo up to her, and she settles the boy in front of her, wrapping her arms around his tiny frame. The man swings up behind her, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. He takes the reins. Hold on, he says, and the horse begins to move, carrying them away from the shack that had nearly become their tomb. The journey was a blur of rhythmic movement and the steady warmth of the man's body shielding her from the wind. She didn't know his name or where he was taking her, only that for the first time in a long time, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. The ranch was not a place of comfort, but of function. It sat in a shallow basin, protected from the worst of the wind by a low rise of granite and a sparse stand of cottonwoods clinging to a dry creek bed. The house was a simple, sturdy cabin of hewn logs, chinked tight against the elements. A barn, a corral, and a few other outbuildings stood nearby, all built with the same stark, practical purpose. There were no flowers, no painted fences, no feminine touches to soften the landscape's brutal honesty. This was a place of work and survival, and nothing more. He slid from the horse and reached up for Leo, taking the boy from her again. She dismounted stiffly, her muscles screaming in protest. He led the way into the cabin. The inside was as spare as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding basic provisions filled the main room. A single, neatly made bed occupied one corner, a stark testament to his solitude. He laid Leo down on the bed, pulling a thick wool blanket over him. The boy was already asleep, the faint flush of life returning to his cheeks. "There's stew on the stove," the man said, gesturing with his chin. "Eat." Slowly, he moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, fetching a bowl and spoon. He filled the bowl with a thick, savory stew of rabbit and root vegetables and set it on the table. He didn't sit with her. He stood by the hearth, his back to her, giving her the privacy to eat without being watched. The first spoonful was agony and ecstasy. Her stomach, shrunken and angry, cramped in protest, but the rich, hot food was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She followed his order, eating slowly, deliberately, making the meal last. When she was finished, she felt the first stirrings of true strength return. She looked at the man, who was now cleaning a rifle by the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt small, inadequate. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unchanged. Name's Silas. He didn't ask for hers. He didn't need to. He went back to his work, the rhythmic click and slide of the oilcloth on steel the only sound in the room besides the crackle of the fire. That night, he gave her the bed. He took a spare blanket and laid it out on the floor by the hearth without ceremony. When she tried to protest, he cut her off with a single, sharp look. "The boy needs his mother close. You take the bed." It was not an act of chivalry. It was an act of logic. And yet, as she lay down beside her sleeping son, the scent of wood smoke and clean linen rising from the pillow, Sarah felt a profound sense of safety she hadn't known since her husband, Daniel, had died. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Silas was a man of few words and constant motion. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set, his life dictated by the needs of his small herd of cattle, the mending of fences, and the endless war against a land that was always trying to reclaim what was his. In the first few days, as her strength returned, Sarah did what she could within the cabin. She swept the floors, washed the few dishes they used, and mended a tear in one of his work shirts with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box. She did it not just from gratitude, but from a desperate need to prove her use, to show she was not just another mouth to feed. He never acknowledged her work directly, but she would see him run a thumb over the neat line of her stitches or notice the cabin holding a cleanliness it hadn't before. It was a silent conversation of action and observation. Leo was the one who broke the silence. Once his strength returned fully, his 4-year-old curiosity could not be contained. He followed Silas to the barn, his small legs pumping to keep up. He'd sit on a hay bale for hours, watching Silas curry a horse or mend a piece of tack, his small face a mask of solemn concentration. Silas, for his part, never told the boy to go away. He seemed to accept his small shadow as a part of the landscape. One afternoon, Leo toddled up to Silas as he was splitting firewood, the axe rising and falling with powerful, metronomic precision. The boy held out a perfectly round, smooth gray stone he'd found by the creek bed. He offered it to the big man with all the gravity of a king presenting a crown jewel. Silas paused, the axe resting on the chopping block. He looked down at the small, upturned hand, then at Leo's hopeful face. He wiped his palms on his trousers, crouched down, and took the stone. He turned it over in his large, calloused hand, studying it as if it were truly precious. Good rock, he said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. He slipped it into his pocket. The next evening, after the chores were done, Silas sat by the fire, whittling a small piece of scrap wood. Sarah watched him from the table, where she was kneading dough for the next day's bread. His large hands, which could wield an axe with such force, moved with surprising delicacy. He carved and shaped the wood until a small, rough-hewn horse began to emerge. He sanded it smooth with a piece of leather and, when he was done, held it out to Leo. The boy's eyes went wide. He took the toy with a gasp of delight, his small fingers tracing its shape. He looked from the wooden horse to Silas, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He scrambled into Silas's lap, holding the horse up for his inspection. Silas stiffened for a moment and used to the contact, but then a hand came up to rest gently on Leo's back. It was in these small, quiet moments that the foundations of a fragile trust were laid. Sarah learned about Silas not from words, but from the way he treated his animals with a firm but gentle hand, the way he could predict the weather by the color of the sky, the way a deep sadness sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The cabin, she discovered, had once held more life. In a dusty trunk at the foot of the bed, she found a small, faded tintype of a woman with a kind smile and a baby wrapped in a christening gown. She closed the trunk quickly, feeling like an intruder, but now she understood the source of the quiet grief that clung to the corners of the cabin like dust. He had lost his own family. That was why he understood her desperation and why he held Leo with such careful reverence. Her own story came out in pieces. One evening, as they sat in comfortable silence, she found herself talking about Daniel, about the farm they'd bought with all their savings, and the cholera that had swept through and taken him in less than a week. She told him how the bank had taken the farm, how she'd sold everything she had just to buy a wagon ticket west, chasing a rumor of work that had evaporated by the time she arrived. She didn't cry. She spoke of it all with a dull, matter-of-fact exhaustion. Silas listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the fire. When she was finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then he rose, went to the shelf, and brought back a small tin of coffee. Coffee was a luxury. He'd never made it before. He brewed a pot, and they drank it together in the firelight, the shared ritual a quiet acknowledgement of her pain. About a month after her arrival, their supplies ran low. The trip to the town of Redemption was necessary. Silas loaded up the wagon, and Sarah climbed onto the seat beside him, with Leo nestled between them. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. In Silas's isolated world, she was just Sarah. In town, she would be something else, a woman living with a man who was not her husband, a burden, a charity case. Redemption was little more than a dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, but it was filled with eyes. As Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, the silence on the street was deafening. Faces appeared in windows. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking and just stared. Sarah felt her face flush with heat. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, clutching Leo's hand. Silas seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He swung down and helped her and Leo from the wagon as if they were his own family. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of pickles, leather, and unspoken judgment. The storekeeper, a thin, sour-faced man named Abernathy, watched them approach the counter, his lips pressed into a disapproving line. "Silas," he said, his tone clipped. His gaze flickered to Sarah, lingering for a moment with cold assessment before dismissing her entirely. "Heard you picked up a stray." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Sarah flinched as if struck. She felt every eye in the store on her. She wanted to disappear. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply placed his list on the counter and leaned forward slightly, his sheer size seeming to shrink the space behind the counter. His voice was dangerously quiet. "She's with me, Abernathy." It wasn't an explanation. It was a warning. "Now, I need flour, salt, coffee, and 10 pounds of beans." Abernathy hesitated, his gaze flicking from Silas's stony face to the other customers. He saw no support there, only wary curiosity. He swallowed. Right away, Silas. The rest of the transaction was completed in tense silence. As they left the store, the whispers started up behind them like the rustle of dry leaves. On the ride back to the ranch, Sarah stared at her hands, the shame still burning in her cheeks. Silas said nothing for miles. Then, As the familiar shape of his land came into view, he spoke. "What they think," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "Don't put food on the table or keep the winter cold out. It's noise. Nothing more." The words were a shield, and she gratefully took shelter behind them. The seasons began to turn. The harsh brown of the prairie gave way to the fleeting green of spring. Sarah planted a small garden near the creek bed, coaxing stubborn life from the hard soil. The work was grounding, giving her a sense of ownership, a feeling of putting down roots, however shallow. She found a purpose beyond mere survival. The cabin began to feel less like Silas's refuge and more like their home. Laughter, mostly Leo's, sometimes hers, began to fill the quiet spaces. One evening, she was singing a soft lullaby to Leo as she put him to bed. When she came back into the main room, Silas was standing by the window, looking out into the twilight. "That song," he said, his voice thick. "My wife," she used to sing that. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. Sarah's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shook his head, turning from the window. The grief in his eyes was raw. "It's good to hear it in this house again." It was a confession, an admission of the loneliness he had carried for so long. The unspoken thing that had existed between them, a fragile bond of gratitude and necessity, was beginning to transform into something deeper, something that felt perilously like affection. But the world, and its noise, was not so easily kept at bay. The coming of spring also brought circuit riders and officials, making their rounds through the territory. One hot afternoon, as Silas was out checking on a newborn calf, a buggy rattled up the path to the cabin. A man in a dusty black coat and a silver badge climbed out. Sheriff Brody. Sarah's heart plummeted. He was a man known for his rigid interpretation of the law and his even more rigid sense of morality. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, though his eyes were cold. "I'm here on behalf of the good people of Redemption. We've had some concerns." Sarah stood in the doorway, her body a barrier between the man and her son, who was playing on the floor inside. "Concerns about what, Sheriff?" "About your living situation. It ain't proper, a woman and child living out here with a man you ain't married to. And him being—" Well, him, he meant Silas's reputation as a recluse, a man who kept to himself and was therefore suspect. "Folks are worried about the boy. An environment like this is no place to raise a child." The implication was clear. He was questioning her fitness as a mother. The old fear, the fear of having Leo taken from her, rose up like bile in her throat. "He is safe here," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He is fed and cared for. Mr. Blackwood has been nothing but good to us." "That may be," the sheriff said, unimpressed. "But it ain't right. There are procedures for this sort of thing. The church has a fund. We can see about getting the boy into a proper home, an orphanage, and finding you some suitable work in town." He was going to take Leo. The thought was a physical blow. Just then, Silas rode up, his face darkening as he saw the sheriff's buggy. He dismounted, his movements coiled with tension. "Brody, what do you want?" The sheriff straightened up, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "Silas, I've come about the woman and the boy. The town council has decided this arrangement can't continue. It's a matter of public decency." Silas walked until he was standing directly in front of the sheriff, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He didn't look at Brody. His eyes were on Sarah, on her pale, terrified face. He saw the fight in her, the fierce, protective love that he had come to admire more than anything. He saw the home she had made from his empty house. He saw the life that had returned to this valley, a life he hadn't realized he was starving for until it arrived. The thought of the silence returning, of the cabin becoming empty again, was more terrifying than any winter storm or prairie fire. He had a choice. He could let the world and its noise win, or he could stand his ground. He had spent years building walls around his heart. Now, he was going to tear one down. He turned his gaze to the sheriff, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an oath. "You'll do no such thing. I have the authority." "Silas," Brody blustered, taken aback by his quiet intensity. "This is an unfit home." "You're wrong," Silas said. He took a step back, moving to stand beside Sarah on the cabin's threshold. He looked at her, his winter sky eyes holding hers, asking a question that had nothing to do with the sheriff and everything to do with the future. "This is a family home." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was firm, possessive, a public declaration. Sarah is my intended. We'll be married by the next preacher that passes through. Her son is my son. This is their home. Now, unless you have a warrant charging me with a crime, you'll get in your buggy and leave my property." The sheriff stood there, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to Sarah's. She was no longer the frightened, starving woman he'd heard about in town. She stood tall, her hand clasped in Silas's, her expression one of fierce, resolute pride. She met his gaze without flinching. "This is my home," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And this is my family." Brody was beaten. He had come expecting to intimidate a fallen woman and a strange recluse. He had found a fortress. He saw the truth in their clasped hands, in the way they stood together as a single, unbreakable unit. There was no law he could use against that. He muttered something under his breath, turned on his heel, and climbed back into his buggy. He drove away without a backward glance, leaving a cloud of dust and defeated silence in his wake. The sound of the buggy faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind in the cottonwoods. The world fell away, and it was just the two of them on the porch, their hands still linked. The air was charged with the words that had been spoken, words that had changed everything. Silas finally let go of her hand, but only to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. The roughness of his skin was a comforting anchor. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "What I said to the sheriff," she stopped him, placing her fingers on his lips. "I know," she whispered. She looked up into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw past the stoicism and the grief to the deep well of kindness and love he had kept hidden for so long. He hadn't just offered her a ride. He had offered her a life. He hadn't just saved her from starvation. He had saved her from despair. And in saving her, he had saved himself. Leo, drawn by the silence, came to the door and slipped his small hand into Sarah's free one. Silas's gaze dropped to the boy, and a slow, genuine smile transformed his weathered face. He knelt, pulling both of them into a hug that was both fierce and tender, a circle of three against the vast, indifferent prairie. He looked over Sarah's shoulder at the land, at the fences he had mended, at the small garden she had planted. It was no longer just a ranch. It was a promise. It was home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.